One of the favorite verses that Protestants use against Catholics is 2 Timothy 3:16.
All scripture is God-breathed and is therefore profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be proficient, that is, qualified, equipped, or sufficient for performing every good work.
From this verse, they conclude that the canon of Scripture contains everything necessary for the preaching of the faith, rendering sacred tradition and the ecclesiastical magisterium not necessarily infallible.
Teaching of these doctrines and dogmas is a good work. The question is, does the Bible actually sufficiently prepare you to do so?
Catholics have long responded to this use of the verse in two ways. First, some point out the fact that immediately and directly, this verse is meant to refer to the canon of the Old Testament, not the entire canon of sacred Scripture.
First of all, in 2 Timothy 3:16, the writer of the epistle tells Timothy that the scriptures that he has known from childhood are profitable for salvation. What scriptures did Timothy know from childhood? He grew up with, more than probably, the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Second, other apologists will point out that this is a faulty argument, for the question of sola scriptura is distinct from the question of the sufficiency of Scripture. The sufficiency of Scripture concerns the containing of matters of faith and morals within the canon of sacred Scripture. On the other hand, the question of sola scriptura concerns the presence of other infallible rules of faith, such as sacred tradition and the ecclesiastical magisterium. Further, others will point to a novel form of sufficiency called material sufficiency, which they concede is in line with this reading of the text.
Paul says Scripture equips the man of God to perform every good work. Therefore, Scripture is all Christians need. Now, Catholics can agree that Scripture contains all the materials of divine revelation, a material sufficiency of Scripture. But that doesn't mean it's our only infallible rule of faith.
Yet, is there a better response that we can give to the Protestant use of this text? Are there other questions that need to be asked on how we read this text? I believe the answer to these questions is a resounding yes. But in order to discover this better refutation of the Protestant use of this text, we need to point to a different part of this verse. The verse reads in the RSVCE, quote, all scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, end quote. The controversy settles on the first two words, which in Greek are passa graphe. Most of the time, Catholic apologists focus on the word graphe, arguing that this is in reference to the Old Testament scriptures, and therefore, it is absurd to take this as a proof of sola scriptura. Yet, we can make an even stronger argument against this position by pointing to the first word, passa. This word passa can be taken in two senses, a collective sense and a distributive sense. A collective sense means that it is the entire grouping as a whole that is said to have the attribute predicated to them. Thus, for example, if I said that the entire United States is a large country, I would not be saying that every single state in America is big. Rather, I would be saying that the entire country put together is big. A distributive sense means that every member of the group has that predicate. Thus, for example, if I said that the men are rich, I'm not merely saying that they have a large amount of money together. Rather, I'm saying that each and every individual in the group has a large amount of money. So, applied to this verse, it can be taken in two senses. First, if I take it in a collective sense, then it would be better to translate it as all Scripture, which would indicate that the entire canon of Scripture, taken together, whether only of the Old Testament or of the Old and New Testaments, is what is able to achieve the ends listed. Second, if I take it in a distributive sense, then it would be better to translate it as every Scripture, or maybe something like every writing, or every book inspired by God. Thus, the sense would be in reference to each individual inspired book being able to achieve the ends listed. From this, it is quite clear the evident difficulty that this would pose to a Protestant apologist who attempts to use this verse in this way. Rather than having the entire canon of Scripture be sufficient for the ends listed, it would have each and every book sufficient for the ends listed. So we would have to ask them whether Philemon, or 1 John, or 3 John, or the Gospel according to St. John are sufficient for the ends listed, rather than saying the canon of the Old and New Testaments is sufficient for the ends listed. Thus, it would be completely absurd to use this verse to argue for sola scriptura. But up to this point, I've merely stated the different opinions. I haven't argued for either one of the readings. So from the grammar of the text, which reading is proper? I would argue that from the grammar of the text, we can clearly see that the distributive reading is more likely. In order to determine this, what we need to look at is we need to look at parallel uses. When we look at grammatical indicators, we're able to see which reading is more likely. In this text, there are a number of different indicators surrounding passa that makes the distributive reading more appealing. First, there is no definite article. In English, the definite article is the, and is often employed to particularize a statement. Thus, rather than saying man or a man, we may say the man. In a similar way, the definite article can be added to terms in Greek in order to specify a particular thing. Here, there is no definite article. It is simply passa in this text. Second, the term is singular rather than plural. In English, we don't really use the definite article when we say all or every. Rather, we use different terms to clarify. Further, we also do not have a plural or singular that we employ. We don't apply an S at the end of all and make it alls, or an S at the end of every to make it everys. Yet in Greek, since they only have pas in order to distinguish between the term all, which refers to the collective sense, and every, which refers to the distributive sense, they need to use different grammatical forms in order to indicate these differences. The grammatical form that this takes when it refers to the distributive use of pas is exactly what we see in 2 Timothy 3:16, singular and lacking a definite article. To give a few examples, Matthew 7:17 states, quote, "Every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit," end quote. It would be absurd to translate pandendron as all trees, as if the collection of good trees is what bears good fruit. Rather, the appropriate translation would be every tree, distributive rather than collective. We see such a construction in a number of other places. For example, Matthew 12:36 states, quote, "I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting for it in the day of judgment," end quote. Clearly, it is every word, not all the words taken together. I could keep going on, but you see the point. Thus, the NAT Bible notes, quote, "There is very little difference in sense between every scripture, emphasizing the individual portions, and all scripture, emphasizing the composite whole. The former option is preferred because it fits the normal use of the word all/every in Greek, as well as Paul's normal sense for the word scripture in the singular without the article, as here. So every scripture means every individual portion of scripture," end quote. There are other details that could be noted as well, such as the absence of a verb, but these get quite complicated. Now, what is said in the NAT Bible note, repeating authors like Wallace, is flatly false from a logical point of view. It is an entirely different assertion to say that the whole of Scripture is God-breathed and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, and every Scripture is God-breathed and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. In the former case, the ends presented in verse 17, that is, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work, is acquired in different ways. Does it require each and every book taken together to equip for every good work, or does each and every book do this? As we will see, the latter exegesis forms a strong and solid basis for traditional Catholic exegetical practices, such as the use of the senses of Scripture. But someone may object that there are actually certain uses of this grammatical construction that are taken in the collective sense. For example, in Romans 11:26, it mentions that, quote, "all Israel will be saved." But in response to this, it is important to point out that this assumes a certain reading of the text. On the other hand, in the Catholic tradition, as Cornelius a Lapide points out, all three traditional readings of the text uses all in the distributive sense. First, some authors believe that Israel refers to spiritual Israel. Thus, every single Jew and Gentile who are joined as the children of Abraham by faith are to be saved. Thus, Lapide writes, quote, "Some interpret Israel here not as carnal but as spiritual, meaning all believers from the Jews and Gentiles who are to be saved. Thus, Theodoret, Augustine, Jerome, and Caesarius understand it. However, it is clear that the apostle, throughout this entire chapter, is speaking of carnal Israel, not spiritual Israel. This is what all the other fathers and interpreters, both Greek and Latin, teach," end quote. Second, some authors interpret it as a physical and distributive sense, to where Israel refers to carnal Israel, and it refers to every single individual, without exception, being saved. Thus, Lapide continues, quote, Secondly, St. John Chrysostom, Ambrose, Origen, and Hilary explain it better. All Israel, they say, meaning all the Jews. For this reason, St. John Chrysostom, St. Thomas Aquinas, Cajetan, and Soto conclude from this passage that all the Jews, without exception, will be converted and saved at the end of the world. End quote. Third, some authors refer to this as carnal Israel and use all in the distributive sense, but refers to the collection of individuals not as a physical whole, but as a moral whole, just as we may speak of the consensus of the fathers as a moral consensus rather than a physical consensus, thus giving away to individual exceptions, but the exceptions are not normal. Thus, Lapide continues, quote, thirdly, and most excellently, all Israel, that is, almost all, or the majority from each of the tribes of Israel, except for one tribe, Dan, will be converted and saved at the end of the world. I exclude the tribe of Dan, because none of this tribe are marked among the 144,000, sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel in Revelation 7. Hence, many believe that the Danites will adhere to their fellow tribesmen, the Antichrist. Indeed, St. Hippolytus and many others teach that the Antichrist will have the Jews as his chief followers and defenders. Therefore, not absolutely all Jews will be converted to Christ at the end of the world. End quote. Besides being ignorant of the traditional exegesis of this text, which is all in the distributive sense, it also fails to realize that in certain cases, grammatical exceptions are given when a proper noun such as Israel is used, whereas in our case, a proper noun is not used. This reading is not novel or something merely given by modern exegetes, but is present among the fathers, medieval, and Baroque commentators on sacred scripture. In fact, this reading shows us that it is not merely the entire canon, or even entire books, which are supposed to spiritually profit the man of God, but every single chapter, every single paragraph, every sentence, clause, and word of sacred scripture is meant to equip the man of God for teaching, for reproof, etc. This lays the foundation for the uniquely Catholic mode of exegesis, which is showed forth very clearly among the fathers of the Church, and perfected among the medieval authors, especially by St. Thomas Aquinas. Be sure to like, comment, and share this video. If you want more on this topic of sola scriptura, be sure to check out my longer video on this topic called The Ultimate Refutation of Sola Scriptura, or my other video called The Worst Argument for Sola Scriptura. If you like this video, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/militantthomist to support my future work. That's all that I have for you, and as always, God bless.